Hey everyone, it's Mr. Alviar, back for another night of Cabin on Trouble Creek. The end of chapter 12 is where we left off, and if you remember, Daniel was on his way back to the cabin from the mill, where he was able to get a sack of cornmeal for him and his little brother Will. And by the time that corn was ground and it was ready to go, the sun was high in the sky, and that meant that Daniel was going to have to walk home in the dark. And so, as it turns to dark, he starts to hear, at first, some tiny rustlings of sounds. Small animals, birds maybe. And then he realizes that those tiny rustlings were actually creatures that were following him with padded feet. He could tell by the sound of the animal walking that they had padded feet like dogs or cats, right? So I think he now realizes that they're actually wolves. Here's where we left off, the end of chapter 12. He was nearly to the cabin, Daniel thought. It just had to be around the next bend. So he kept walking, feeling the heavy weight of that meal sack on his aching shoulder. Just don't look back, he told himself. Don't look back. Just keep going. The footsteps padded behind him, and they seemed to be getting closer. But Daniel stumbled on, and all at once he saw it. A dark, squarish shape right ahead. The tall stacks of wood on either side, and someone moving next to the open door. Yes, it was the cabin. "Will!" he shouted. Somehow, Daniel found the strength to run forward as his brother came to meet him. "You're back," he said. And even in the dim light, Daniel could make out the relief on Will's face. He set down the sack at last by the cabin door. "I got the meal," he said. January, the end of chapter 12. Here we are, the beginning of chapter 13. The first snows came 2 days later. Large flakes danced in the air, swirling white against the dark trees, and then melting quickly as they touched the ground. The snow seemed to stop as darkness fell, but when Daniel looked out the door the next morning, the branches of the trees were etched in white. A light coating covered the stumps and the woodpiles, and he brushed it off as he carried in more wood for the fire. Better bring in extra, he thought. Keep a good-sized pile next to the fireplace, in case the next snow is deep. Get a good supply of water, too, he thought. His hands were cold. If he were home, he'd be wearing the heavy gray mittens that Ma knitted for all of them, made from the wool of their own sheep. What could he do for mittens here, he wondered. He and Will talked about it while they ate their breakfast of hot mush. Will had cooked up a bigger pot this time, Daniel noticed. Since his trip to the mill, it was a relief not to have to skimp on meals. We could use the scraps from our blanket coats to make mittens, Daniel suggested. Well, that would most likely do for most of the days. Still, if it got really cold, one layer of wool wouldn't be enough to keep their hands warm. How do the wild critters stay warm on the coldest days? Or maybe the rabbit skins, said Will. Why, that was it. Animals had their fur to keep them warm. Why hadn't he thought of that before? Saving the skins from the rabbits that they'd caught. Daniel was beginning to see that you couldn't waste anything living in these woods. That was one of the lessons that Solomon had been trying to teach them, only he hadn't been paying close enough attention. That's what we'll do, Daniel decided. We'll make rabbit fur mittens. It took a few days to catch the rabbits that they needed. 2 or 3 would be enough, Daniel figured. This time the boys were as interested in the skins as the meat. Carefully they slit them from top to bottom. They scraped the skins clean and then worked them with their hands to keep them soft. Feeling the fur against his fingers, Daniel could tell that these mittens would be plenty warm, warmer even than Ma's mittens. As with their blanket coats, they used themselves as a pattern, cutting around their hands to make mitten shapes. Again, they poked holes along the edges with a knife point and used fiber thread to sew the two halves together, the fur on the inside. Will tried his on. They're warm, he said, but sort of stiff. Daniel agreed. The rabbit fur would keep them warm on the coldest of days, and though the skins were stiff now, most likely they would soften up with use. Maybe we could make hats, too, suggested Will. Of course. They would collect more rabbit skins and fashion them into warm fur hats. And perhaps, Daniel thought, they could even use rabbit fur to line their shoes. He had only one worry. What would happen when the deeper snows came? Would they still be able to catch rabbits in their snares? Or would the rabbits, along with the other small creatures, sleep through the coldest days of winter in their warm burrows? And what about fish? If the creek froze, as it was likely to, would the fish still be there under the ice? Could Will break through the spear with them? Or break through and spear them? Now that they had enough meal, would they have anything else to eat in the weeks ahead? The next few days were wintry cold and damp. A slow drizzle fell off and on, mixing with brief flurries of snow. The trees seemed to hunch over them, looming dark and heavy against the gray sky. It was as if the trees were bracing themselves, Daniel thought, for harsh weather to come. Each morning the boys checked their snares. One day they had a rabbit, and they saved its skin for their fur hats. Another day they found a possum. Daniel didn't favor the taste, but it would make a change from the rabbit, he thought. For several days after that, though, they found nothing in their traps. And once again, Daniel wondered if winter weather was making game scarce. One morning, they woke to find a new dusting of snow on the woodpiles. The air was so cold that Daniel's ears felt nipped with frost as he and Will walked down to the creek. And just as he'd feared, Daniel saw that a thin coating of ice had formed across the widest part of the creek, where the water moved most slowly. Will broke a hole in the ice with the heavy end of his fishing spear, and he peered down into the dark water. "I can't see much," he muttered, frowning. He couldn't stand in the water now that it was so cold. How would he be able to spear his fish? Will tried fishing from the creek bank, but that didn't work, and nor did standing on a rock in the shallow water. He thrust his spear at a small ripple and nearly slid into the stream himself. But Will didn't give up, because he never would. Back home, Will would try anything that anyone said couldn't be done. Swimming across a pond, shooting a squirrel out of a tall pine tree, jumping off a rock ledge. He'd hurt his foot so bad that time that Ma thought it was broken. Will stepped onto the old rotting log that lay half in and half out of the water. "Be careful," warned Daniel. "It's slippery." Will walked slowly to the end where the log began to submerge into the creek, and he turned around, grinning. "My moccasins don't slip at all," he said. "They're much better than those old shoes." He cracked the ice all around the log with his spear. Crouching down, he stared for a long time into the water. Daniel was surprised all over again at how patient Will could be. Just as he had so many times before, he waited without moving for a fish to come by. And it was a long wait. Daniel's feet got so cold he could barely feel his toes. He stamped on the wet, hard bank to get his blood moving again. He was beginning to think the fish were all sleeping in the frozen mud when suddenly he saw Will's spear dart into the water, and excitedly Will lifted it out. "I got—" he started to say, and then he looked down in dismay. "Oh, I guess it got away." "But you saw it, right?" Daniel asked anxiously. "You really saw a fish?" Will nodded. "They're down there, and I'm going to catch one." Stubbornly, Will stayed on that log, his spear ready in his hand. He'd stay there until their feet both froze into solid blocks of ice, Daniel thought. Pa wouldn't let that happen if he was here. He'd tell Will not to be foolish and that he had to quit now, and come back and try again another day. Daniel was just about forming those words when Will gave a sudden yelp. "Ah!" And he looked up to see the fishing spear stuck straight up in the water, and Will struggling to keep his balance on the end of the log. His arms waved crazily in the air, and then one foot slipped out from under him, and with a loud splash, Will fell into the creek. Daniel's first thought was to rush in and pull him out, but Will was already on his feet in the water that barely covered his knees, and he was holding up his spear in triumph, because on one end of the large spear was a large, wriggling fish. "I got him!" he crowed happily. "My biggest one yet!" He was grinning from ear to ear as he waded to shore. Luckily, he hadn't lost his moccasins. And he hadn't been wearing his rabbit fur mittens, so he didn't lose those either. His breeches and blanket coat were sopping wet, though, and covered with mucky leaves and twigs. Even his hair was plastered with mud. He stood dripping on the bank. "It's cold," Will mumbled, suddenly shivering. Daniel saw that his face was gray as fireplace ashes, and now his whole body was shaking. "Come on," he said. "We need to get to the cabin." "Fish!" Will could barely get out the word, but Daniel knew what he meant. He wasn't going to go without his fish. "I've got it," he said. His arm around Will's shoulders, Daniel hurried him up the path. Will couldn't speak at all, just kept shaking all over like someone with palsy, and now his face was turning blue. Inside, Daniel piled wood onto the fire until it blazed up bright and hot, and then he stripped off Will's wet clothes and he wrapped him in their blanket and sat him as close as he could to the fire. But Will couldn't stop shaking. Daniel took off his own coat and wrapped that around him too. Will looked up at him gratefully, but still, he kept shivering. What else could he do? Daniel wondered. What else? He tried to think. If Ma were here, what would she do? Why, she would make Will a steaming cup of tea with her special brew of herbs, and she'd say, "Drink this before you catch your death of cold." Well, Daniel couldn't do that. All he could think of was to cook up some hot mush. He made a batch, keeping one eye on Will all the while, and fed small bites of it to him. And after that, he cleaned the fish and roasted it over the fire. By then, Will's color was starting to return. But he still had bouts of violent shivering. "Mighty tasty fish," he croaked, trying to grin. "Shh," said Daniel. "Don't talk." "Why?" Why, Daniel thought, why hadn't he stopped Will before he fell into the creek? He should have known something like this was going to happen. What if Will really did catch his death of cold? They sat quietly close to the fire. Whenever the flames began to die down, Daniel piled on another large log. He was going to keep the cabin warm no matter how much wood it took, no matter if he had to stay awake all night long to do it. Finally, he noticed that Will had fallen asleep, and he watched his brother's thin chest moving slowly, evenly, up and down. Good. It looked like the shaking had stopped at last. Daniel let out a long breath of relief. More than likely, he thought, Will would be all right in the morning. But Daniel kept watching him, just to make sure. After a while, his eyes wandered over to the big log next to the fireplace, to all the marks that he'd made with his knife, counting the days till Pa's return. He hadn't made any marks the last few days. He had been so busy, or so tired at night, that he'd forgotten to do it. Or maybe there was another reason. Maybe he was no longer expecting Pa and Ma and the rest of the family to arrive at the cabin any day now. Daniel didn't know anymore how many weeks it had been. He couldn't think about why they hadn't come or if they ever would. All he knew was it was winter now, and he and Will were on their own. The end of chapter 13. Oh. Will. Stubborn Will. Does things without thinking, doesn't he? Daniel, he just can't stop Will from doing the things that are going to cause himself to be injured or cause himself to be unsafe. But he loves him. That's what brothers do, right? And thank goodness Will is going to be okay, because Daniel would have to spend a very long winter alone and sad without his younger brother, especially if Pa and Ma really don't ever come. Thank you for listening tonight, boys and girls. We'll read chapter 14 another time. Have a great night. You know what to do. Go and brush those teeth. Wash your hands and wash your face. Get into your pajamas. Tell everyone you love them. Make sure that room is cleaned too. It's always nice to see parents walk in to kiss you goodnight, tell you they love you. They like to see that room clean too. All right, that's just the parent in me. I like to see a clean room. All right. Have a great night, everybody. Do what I told you. See, Bo says the same thing. Brush your teeth. Wash your hands. I'm telling them, Bo. Wash your hands. Wash your face. Get to bed. Have a super night, everybody.